The fly we want to share with you is the Baron. The dressing is taken from C.E. Price Cannock's book, How to Dress Salmon Flies, since it is a book that seems most available to tyers today due to recent reprinting. Now, let's begin with a blind eye hook made for me by Eugene Sunday of Flushing, Michigan. Now, the first step we're going to have to do with our blind eye hook is put on the Spanish silkworm gut loop. What we're going to do in applying the gut loop is we're going to be putting it on the bottom of the shank of the hook. Now, it won't be directly tight against the bottom. It will be slightly separated and just a little bit to either side. In making this loop, let me say that the way I approach it is with 3 strands. And I very simply twist those 3 strands together. Now, in order to get as smooth an application with thread here as possible so I don't have any extra lumps and bumps, I'm going to chew the ends of the gut to flatten them out and to spray them out a little bit. And also you notice that each one is slightly tapered adjacent to the other. And that'll make the thread application a little bit smoother here. I'm going to be tying it in about right here, not right at the point of the hook, but right about in this area. So that this area is kept completely clean, right out near the tip. The head is going to be covering about right here, and the throat of the fly is going to be right in this area. I'm not going to extend this gut very far back, as a lot of the old salmon fly hooks were tapered to extend this gut loop back. This is frankly more for show than anything else, so I'm not going to extend this very far back. Also, I've had Gene, in making his hooks, try and taper it just pretty much near the end of the eye, as you will see in a little bit. This is called nipping, and we're going to shape this in a particular way to get this nice little round shape. A lot of times you'll see flies that are somewhat of a casual oval or lopsided or whatever. I like to be rather particular about this and make it a nice consistent shape that coincides more with the way that I read Kelton. Now, in putting on the gut loop, first of all, I'm going to begin the thread, as I mentioned before, fairly close to the tip of the hook. I want to show you techniques that I always do at this point. And you'll notice very quickly when I flutter this thread that I think you might be able to see on your camera, on your television, that there are some twists in the thread. This is Flymaster thread, and it comes somewhat inherent with twists in it. So if you counterspin, spin the bobbin counterclockwise. Let me bring that up so you can see what direction I'm going. And counterclockwise, you'll get those twists out of the thread. Also, every time that you're making a revolution around the hook in this manner, you're putting a twist this direction into the thread. So you can get much, much smoother wraps by simply counterspinning your thread. Now I'm going to go ahead and continue wrapping now that I've counterspun that thread. Also notice I'm going to pull this piece of thread out to me a little bit so that it forces this thread into a locking position against the adjacent wrap. So if you see me throughout this tape frequently counterspinning thread, that's what I'm doing, is trying to get those twists out. I'm going to put a little bit of a basic thread foundation down, and then we're going to go ahead and put on the gut loop in a moment. Now, what I'm going to do is, with very flat, smooth thread, wind in 2 or 3 wraps right back up to this point, right up here, just shy of the point of the hook. And the reason I'm doing that is to avoid excessive wraps of simply going over and over and over and building up bulk. You can do this and get away with it very easily as long as you have counterspun the thread and you simply take the thread and you fan it like this. You know, that's called a mistake. Reel back up again. Fan the thread. Come right to here. Now the next step will be to go ahead and put the gut loop on. And what I have done in advance is I have prepared the nip in the gut loop by simply taking the gut dry, putting it around, in this case, a bobbin, bringing it back, and pinching it. Simply pinching the 2 ends together to form a little bit of a round circle so that the end product looks like this. Now, I'm going to apply the gut loop underneath the shank of the hook. First I'll start on the far side and bring it back, and then I'll bring the near side in and tie it in place. Then we're going to be chewing these ends, spraying them, tapering them out, and tying them down. We'll show you those steps as we go along. Now what I've done thus far is I've simply tied the far side in from just behind the termination of the blind eye hook back to the point that I ended my initial thread wraps before I fanned and went forward. These ends are going to be cut off and tapered and chewed and tied down in the remainder of this taper that goes to about here on this particular hook. The most dramatic portion of the taper was here. This is the rest of the taper to exactly here. Now, this is not exactly under the center of the hook, remember, it's very slightly to the back side. I'm going to now place on the front side in the same fashion with very smooth wraps going forward. Once I get to the forward portion, I'm going to fan my thread and come back to this point once again. Now, as you can see, I've wrapped forward and smooth wrapped, and I've stopped right at the same point I began the thread initially, and also where I began wrapping the far side in. Let me turn it up so you can see the bottom of the hook. I don't know how well you can see it there. Probably can't really distinguish it, but it's not exactly adjacent to one another, touching in this area. They're very slightly on either side of the hook, just very slightly. Actually, by doing that, it's going to give a little bit more support to the wing by pulling these out just a little bit in this fashion. The underwing is going to go dead center on the top of the hook. The wings are going to be supported somewhat by this gut loop. At least that's the approach that I like to take. Now I'm going to take the thread and fan it. Now I've got it counterspun. I'm going to fan it and bring it back, and we're going to stop right here. The next step that we're going to make is to bring these guys out here, wet them slightly so that I can more easily separate them now that everything is secured here and it won't untwist. Wet them slightly and then chew the ends after and then after that I'm going to be cutting the ends so that I get a nice even taper. Now what I've done is gone ahead and tied in the ends that I've pretty well chewed, and I've also tapered them as I showed on the drawing. You may be able to notice that there is a slight hollowness right in here that we need to fill. I'm going to whip finish and get rid of the black thread and go to primrose thread in just a moment. And I'll fill that in with my whip finish. I'm going to whip finish from the back to the front. It makes for much smoother whip finish. And try it the other way and you'll find that you tend to get a lump. If you whip finish with your wraps progressing forward, you'll find it's much, much smoother. We'll begin back here and simply make nice, smooth wraps to very simply fill that hollow, and that's all we're doing. Now to get rid of the thread, I'm going to slice the thread. I'm not going to cut the thread, I'm going to slice the thread. What I mean by that is the scissors are very slightly separated. I'm going to push into it. What that does, it leaves no residual by simply putting a little pressure here on this thread. It allows it to slice it off and tuck that little frayed end back up underneath so you don't have any extra lumps or bumps. It's very valuable anytime you're tying off and don't want the thread to show, particularly at the head. Here's the finished view of the gut loop. Now the next step will be putting on the tag of the fly. And we're going to be putting on silver twist and ruby red floss. First object will be to put on the twist. And the application will be probably 4, 5, 6 wraps depending on the tier's viewpoint. I'll probably put on 5 wraps. I'm going to begin my thread at essentially the point where the tail is going to be tied in. Thread will be tied in here. It will secure the twist, and I'll wrap very smooth, counterspun wrap the thread back to a point right here. Now it's going to be 1 thread width shy of being where I want my first wrap of twist to be. The reason is the thread will stop here, the twist will begin here. If I come on down with my thread wrap, of course it's going to cover, and we're going to push the twist back 1 more tinsel wrap. So, this is the bottom view, to give you an idea of what we want to look like. Also, when we come down with the first tinsel and our thread securing in place, you'll see it's not exactly in the center of the bottom of the hook. It's going to be a little bit near the tire if you're right-handed. And it's going to come down, be secured here, form a 90-degree angle abruptly, wrapped on around, brought back up, secured, and with a 90-degree angle brought up adjacent to the tinsel that came back in the first place. Why I like to put it alongside of the tinsel like this is no extra lumps or bumps for one reason. And also when the thread comes around, it'll come around in this fashion, in this direction, and actually pull this tinsel up and butt it up against this tinsel. Makes a nice tight connection and a nice smooth area so that the floss doesn't have any extra lumps and bumps when we come back down again. Now, I'm going to introduce primrose thread because it's very easy for me to see, and simply secure in about 3 wraps of thread and let my bobbin hang as a plumb bob to see where I'm at. I want to put these initial wraps in just very slightly behind the point of the hook. And the butt's going to be pretty much right at the point of the hook. Now, once I get those wraps in, I'm going to go ahead and cut off this stub end, get it out of the way. And the next step will be to put in the tinsel. We're going to bring the thread back up and catch the tinsel and draw it underneath and slightly toward the right side of the shank of the hook with a couple of wraps of thread. Make sure that these wraps are nice and smooth. Counterspin periodically to make sure that there's no undue twist in the thread. If you're not happy with it, back up and do it again. Make sure it's nice and clean and smooth. What's happening is the thread pressure here is pushing the tinsel underneath and slightly toward me, so I'm going to pull very slightly away in order for the tinsel to go exactly where I want it to be. We're going to continue wrapping on down to a point, essentially on this particular hook, just about above the barb or very slightly in front of that point. So we'll drop the thread down and check that. Now I'm at a point that I've decided that it looks about 1 thread width away from where I want the tinsel to be. So the first wrap of tinsel is going to be going right here. Now, I'm going to secure this with a wrap of thread and a nice firm wrap of thread, very flat and smooth, no excess lumps and bumps in here. A little bit right here because of the under thread wrap that we initiated, so there's a little bump right there on the top side. Other than that, it's very, very smooth. Come forward more than you think the tinsel itself is actually going to cover. And take your thread and simply get it out of the way. Now, I like to wrap the tinsel oftentimes with hackle pliers because I feel like I have more control of its placement. So I'm going to pull firmly to make sure that I have a nice straight perpendicular line, 90-degree angle coming out from underneath where I've wrapped my tinsel in. Come up and over and around just in front of that wrap. Now to tighten it up just a little bit, I'm going to take my index finger and thumbnail, push that up, snug it up just a little bit so there's no spots that are separated. Then I'm going to unwind my thread, and you'll notice now that I actually, as I mentioned before, overwound where I needed to go. I'll take off those wraps to exactly the point where the material ends, switch hands, come back up underneath, and separate my hands pretty dramatically so that now the tinsel is going at a 90-degree angle forward. My thread wrap is going back over the top. Continue to pull on up and around like this so that it really seats the tinsel up against the other tinsel and at a true 90-degree angle. And you'll notice it'll simply pull right into place with nice smooth thread wrap. Now, what I'm going to do is cut off the tinsel about 1 thread width shy of where I want it to end, and then go ahead and come up and over that and catch that little end so there's no excess stubs hanging down. Next step will be to put on the floss, and you'll notice that I've put on silk gloves. Now, some of you may snicker at that, but a friend in Texas, Al Cohen, suggested that a long time ago. Some have used cotton gloves. Some of us have even tried playing around with surgical gloves, which are a miserable failure in my mind. Vinyl gloves, all kinds of different things. The problem with silk, and this is wiki silk, the problem with silk is it frays incredibly easily. but once it's on, it's very, very pretty. So, and it lays very nicely, and it wraps very nicely. A lot of people still, and probably most people still use rayon, and that's certainly most satisfactory. I like to play with silk, and I've been playing with it for some time. I still tend to go back to rayon in some situations. Use your own choice. You do lose dexterity with a silk glove, but use your own choice. A little technique that I saw Susie Fork, that lives in California, do a long time ago. To wrap in your floss, simply fold the floss over the top of the thread, bring it up and around, and place it in the position that you want. One added step that I do, I don't like the fact that it comes out parallel with the shank of the hook. Since it's going to be going perpendicular when it's actually wrapped, I like to bring it up and seat it in the position that's going to be wrapped, and then take another wrap or two of thread over the top of that just to get things secure and out of the way. Now, in wrapping this floss, first thing I'm going to do is try and get the floss fairly smooth by gently stroking it down. And this is where you can really get into trouble with silk if you're not very, very careful. Come up and over. Notice I have a single strand of Zwicky, just a very small amount. The smaller amount to a degree, the easier it is to control and wrap. You want a lot of bulk, then tie on more floss, but you tend to lose control. What I'm trying to do as I wrap this is keep it as fanned and smooth and even as possible, very slightly overlapping the prior wrap. Now the most important wrap is coming up right now. It's the turnaround. Coming right in here, right at the base of the tinsel, coming up square and over firmly, and very gently bring it forward, fan it slightly, and then begin your wrap forward. What I like to do at this point is oftentimes I'll puff the thread. Just allow it to fan slightly and fan out to make the wrap just a little bit more even. You can also do it without holding on to the shank of the hook if you're careful. The problem is if you let it go too far, you may lose some of a wrap and a half or two and really make a giant mess. So periodically just allow it to fan. And if you see a little rough spot, you can control that rough spot by simply fanning your floss. Just as a comment, you'll notice that periodically I change scissors from a heavier scissor to a finer pointed scissor. The reason for that is if I'm cutting fine materials, I like a fine pointed scissor. If I'm cutting tinsels and so forth, I like to use a more heavy duty scissor to save my scissor blades. What I've done now is finished my wraps up to a point where essentially I began my thread wraps initially in putting in the tinsel in the first place. That is essentially where I cut off the tinsel, and that's where I'm going to secure the floss. Now at this point, I have the floss tied in with thread, holding it in place. Yes and no. Actually, the floss is holding itself in place. I can remove all thread wraps, and you'll see that the floss is totally held in place by itself. Why add extra wraps of thread if it's not necessary? So I'm going to come up and over, secure this little stub down here, bring it up to me, catch it with a smooth counterspun wrap of thread, work the floss forward just exactly like we did the tinsel at the turnaround, and secure it in place. Now you notice that I've continued the thread wrap very slightly forward. This is going to represent the area that we'll be tying in the tail and also the butt of the fly. I'll turn it slightly so you get a little bit of an idea of what we've done thus far. Also, you might notice that I've put a little piece of 3x5 card material into the jaws of the vise. I do that simply to help protect the enamel finish of the hook, and it keeps it from being scratched a bit. What I've done here is made a sketch of a couple of different flies. This is the popham that I recently did, and this is the baron, essentially, that we're going to be doing, just a rough sketch. A friend in Madera, California, Paul Ely, suggested that what you might do sometime is take your hooks, lay them on a photocopier, and then you get a one-to-one reproduction of exactly the hook that you want to use, possibly use different styles, different shapes, and so forth. Make up some of these pieces of paper and make several copies. Take a typewriter eraser or an ink pen eraser, erase the shank portion out of the photocopy, and you're left with a very, very faint background so that you can draw your fly in and get a basic proportion. I know several tyers that use sketches to get ideas of shapes and different techniques and ideas and so forth. And I found it kind of valuable in getting the tail shape in particular, and that's the next thing we're going to cover, is placement of the tail. Making sure that if I want this kind of a shape or this kind of a shape or whatever I choose, I can do that by sketching it out, seeing what the end result is going to be. The most important part of a salmon fly, in my opinion, is the tail. If you don't get the tail placed correctly, the rest of the fly is a miserable failure. It oftentimes on so many new tires I've seen will be way, way, way too long and disproportionate, and it just completely messes up the entire proportions of the whole fly. So you might try that if you'd like to, and see if it helps out in your time. I haven't done very much of it, but I'm playing with it now, and I find it kind of interesting to get kind of an idea of where I want things to be. And we may possibly use this drawing later on to see if we end up with something that looks something like this. But right now I want to get a tail somewhat like this. Actually, I want a tail somewhat between these two, really. A little more curved than this, but not quite as short and as curved as that. So we're going to select a feather, and I select this particular feather. We'll try it and see. Tails are very difficult to find of quality. Toppings are very easy, but tails are difficult to find. And I've selected this one because my plan will be that I think I'll be able to tie it in with this section right in here. This section, it tends to be more pithy, and it will stay very, very flat and not rotate nearly as readily when you tie the tail material in. If you tie the tail material in up in here, it will tend to rotate and twist. Also, if you're putting a veiling into that tail or onto the tail, these barbs right in here tend to lay very flat, whereas these barbs up in here tend to lay alongside of the quill, and in the process, it tends to allow it to slip or rotate. These act somewhat as stabilizers to support that tail veiling. So what I've done, I've gone ahead and tied in this particular tail to the shape and so forth. It pretty well approximates my drawing to my satisfaction. And I put it in with about 5 wraps of thread in this particular case, beginning at the front and progressing backwards and stopping at this point. We're going to next tie in the tail veiling over the top of that and progress forward with a tie-off, then tie in the awesome shrill butt, tying backwards to the point that we want to stop wrapping to secure it in place, then come forward and clip off the excess, wrap the butt, and tie it off. We'll get to that in a little bit, but first of all, let me talk a little bit about preparation of tails. Tails, as I mentioned earlier, are very difficult to select, and trying to find the right one for a particular situation can be a real pain. For instance, this tail obviously is too long, but I chose it because it's big enough you can see what I'm going to do to it. Notice that it's curved way, way too dramatically. I'm going to flatten that curve. I'll never get it to exactly where I want because it's way, way over curved. But I'm going to simply nick it on the back with my fingernail to flatten it out quite a good deal to get it pretty much where I want it to be. You can see it made a big difference in the shape of that particular tail. Also, I like to try and tie down the tail in this area in here. Now, I hope you can see on your television that this area is much more white in color than this area, much more gold in color here and very gray in this portion right here. This is the area that I like to tie down. This is the most pithy portion of the quill. Actually, this is the quill. This is the rachis, but out of habit we all call it the quill. Anyway, this is the most pithy portion. In here, it's second most pithy, and then this area is very, very brittle and stiff and non-giving, very rigid. This is the area that I generally tend to like to tie into. First of all, what I'm going to do is simply strip off the barb on either side of that area. Get rid of this little after feather. Then I'll take flat nose pliers and flatten this area with a flat nose pliers. So now I have a little less bulk, plus it's flattened so that it will secure it in or tie it in a little more cleanly on the top of the shank of the hook. Now the next step will be to put in the tail veiling, and this is an Indian crow substitute feather, and we'll be adding also blue chatterer to this shortly. The Indian crow substitute feather, several people are making those. This one was made for me by Paul Ely. Eric Otzinger in Fullerton, California, at the Marriott Fly Shop. you can acquire some of Eric's substitute feathers. They're quite good, and they're so much better than the solid dyed orange feathers, particularly for veilings. For cheeks, they leave something to be desired, but for body veilings, tail veilings, they're very, very nice. Now, what we're going to do is prepare this feather by shaping it a little bit. With natural Indian crow feather, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes will have a little bit of a knuckling right in the tip of the feather. And we're going to reproduce that knuckling with a little tool that Marvin Nolte in Bar None, Wyoming came up with. And it's a very simple clothespin with a little piece of rubber material right here, very slightly curved. And we're going to lay the feather into this notch with the dull side of the feather facing up so that this portion of the clothespin comes down, presses into it, and forms that little knuckle. Now, what I want to show you is there is a very slight knuckle. Not an extreme one, but a very, very slight knuckle in the feather. A little bit of a curve, and it was put in wet into the jaws of the clothespin and allowed to dry naturally. And then I simply flicked it out and separated it to get this kind of a look and shape. Now we're going to go ahead and smash the quill and tie it in very similar to the way that we tied in the tail of the fly. Now what I've done is tied in the tail veiling directly on top of the tail with one single wrap of thread. In some places, one wrap of thread. I'm getting ready to tie on the chatterer veiling. In this case, I'm using a feather that I found on a parakeet, not a budgie, but a parakeet that had died, and I had borrowed its remains. It's quite a lovely feather, sort of a lilac lavender base going to a blue tip. And most people would use chatterer, but you can find substitutes on various creatures all over the place. So don't be afraid to try substitutes. They can be very useful. The one thing that I've done differently than the the Indian crow substitute is I stripped the Indian crow substitute and smashed the quill and tied it in. Problem on chatterer, oftentimes, kingfisher or real chatterer or various substitutes, is the quill is so tiny and trying to smash it, it tends to rotate. So I leave the barbs on when I smash it, or I trim them off with little stubs remaining and then smash it. And then I leave those stubs on there, and they tend to act somewhat as outriggers when I actually place it on and tie it on. Next step we'll do is I'll go ahead and apply it, lay it on top of the hook, and wind both the Indian crow and the chatterer substitutes forward to exactly this point where the front of the butt will be. Now, after blood, sweat, and tears, I found that this particular feather was not cooperating. Instead of trying to put both feathers on at once and coming forward and reducing my bulk, it was simply impossible. So in this case, I came forward, tied in the Indian crow substitute, and then came backwards with my chatterer substitute. Now I've got one thread width right there that is going to be the first wrap of the ostrich herl. So that's where that's going to begin, and then we'll progress forward up to here and finish off the ostrich herl. We're also going to get rid of these butts here before we finish off the ostrich herl, and in order to get them off, I'm going to very carefully fold them up at a 90-degree angle and then clip them off. Now you'll note here that we have the tail and the shank and so forth. And in tying in this ostrich herl, I've drawn it so that the barb of the barbules of the ostrich barb are toward the back, so that you can see what I've drawn in here, the quill. I'd like to place the quill edge forward. Now, if you look carefully at a herl, you will notice that there's a predominant side with a quill edge like this. And I like to stack the quills one on top of another on top of another and progress forward. If you reverse this direction and put the width of the quill to the back, when you wrap these forward, if you stack them, you will smash the herl that you just wrapped down and toward the back. If that's the end product that you want, so it smashes down and V's back like that, you can accomplish that by putting this quill edge to the back. I want a very short, tight herl right in here. Very short, very abrupt, and very, very tight. And the way I like to accomplish that, as I say, by putting the quill edge forward. You'll notice that the quill is tied, or the barb is tied in at one thread width shy of where I want to actually place it. Again, the same thing as when we're doing the tag. The first wrap is going to be going right over this area right here. If you don't leave room for it, you'll tie it in over the top of the tail and the tail veiling, and you may throw your tail veiling and or tail possibly out of place. Now, when we come forward with our thread wrap, notice there's a little stub end right down here. We've now clipped off the tail and the tail veiling stubs, and we have those little stubs sticking out. That's where we're going to finish off this wrap and secure it. Also, right at that point, we're going to be tying in our rib immediately underneath and then progressing forward with nice, smooth thread wrap. So let's go ahead and do that now, please. Now, what I've done is simply tie in the herl with a little piece of bare quill showing, just like when you tie in a dry fly hackle. Leave a little bare piece of quill, in this case a bare piece of barb, so that the barb you will lay in nice and clean. You begin the wrap initially with the barb, or in the hackle a quill, rather than the barbules in this case being smashed to the back. Leave a little piece of bare quill. And we're going to grab it with hackle pliers, and we've also gone ahead and wrapped our thread forward to essentially where we want the herl to be tied off. I like to wrap herls with hackle pliers. It's a little tender out here and sometimes it will break, so you have to be real careful. If it breaks, we simply grab it again and hope that we have enough left to do the job. Make sure and cover all the primrose thread. The trick is not to smash down anything that you don't want to have smashed down. Now we're going to go ahead and tie this off and simply come up with your thread, one wrap of thread right here. If you feel real brazen, break it off, but if you don't feel real brazen at this point, I want to cut it off, so I'll come in with my scissors and simply try and snip it off. Now, immediately underneath that is going to be our tinsel rib for the back portion of the body. So I'll simply fold that tinsel over the top with enough to go up to the butt area and catch it underneath, and then just continue my wrap forward. What I'm going to try and do is keep this tinsel dead center underneath the shank with very, very smooth, flat wraps of thread. And by thread pressure, I can move it exactly underneath by simply pulling at this point so it tucks underneath. The most critical portion of this particular part is to make sure that these thread wraps are very, very smooth, because we're going to be putting tinsel, smooth tinsel, over the top of this. And if you have any lumps or bumps, flat tinsel is going to show the mistake that you made. Now, what I'd like to show to you is basically what we've done thus far. We've put in our tag, and we put in our tail assembly. We put both veilings onto the tail. And you'll notice that the chatterer substitute is just a little bit short of the Indian crow substitute. There's no particular determination as to length. In this case, it's approximately 1/2 the tail for the Indian crow substitute. The butt's fairly full and flat, and fluffy and flat, fairly consistent. It could be a little bit shorter in length. This happens to be off of a natural black. Notice I've not gone halfway up. What I'm going to do is make the joints in this fly that theoretically should be 50-50. We're going to modify it a little bit. Don't be afraid to modify salmon flies and use substitutes and various arrangements for things. It adds to the pleasure of tying. In this case, what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to cut off this little stub end of the first tinsel rib about 1 thread width shy of where I'm going to put in the joint right here. And the reason for that is if I have a bulk underneath here continuing on up, I have a very distinct lump that the Indian crow veiling that's going to go over this section is going to get me in trouble. It's going to twist. I need to have just as smooth a surface and flat a surface here as possible, so I don't need this extra bulk. So I'm going to cut it off here and then make 1 more thread wrap. Then I'm going to begin my flat tinsel winding backwards and winding forwards, wrapping my rib up and securing the rib, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. As somewhat of a footnote to that, let me add at this point that when I say halfway, I'm talking about usable shanks for body. Now, essentially, that's going to be about from this point, because this is about where the throat's going to be, and this is where the head's going to be on this fly. So from essentially this point back to the butt of the fly is what I'm going to be calling the body. When I say halfway, halfway would then be approximately right in this area. And you can measure that if you'd like to, and some people do. But I like to play around with this a little bit, and I'm tending more and more to bring these so it's not quite necessarily halfway, and make the front of the fly a little bit more dominant. And the throat and the body hackle will carry it through with its weight up here to make it look not quite so out of balance. So that's why I say halfway. That would be about here. Not, you wouldn't measure the entire length of the shank per se. You just figure out basically body, body, somewhere in here, about halfway. Oftentimes when wrapping in tinsel, people will simply tie in the tinsel without any regard to the tip of the tinsel. I think you'll find it much easier if you do something, such as I've drawn here with various papers, to make that beginning wrap a little bit easier for yourself, even if you're using very narrow tinsel, which I tend to use when I'm doing bodies. In this particular instance, it's simply a whack across the flat tinsel to give somewhat of a beveled taper. I tend to prefer this one or this one. What this one is a much more dramatic angle, makes the beginning much cleaner. Also, this is where I'm going to tie it in, right in here. Not actually at the tip. I'll actually cut this portion off or hide it. I'll tie it in about right in this area, then begin wrapping. Begins a nice transition and taper. This also works pretty well, and this one you probably definitely want to whack off, but it seems to catch the thread pretty nicely by making a little notch in it. You can do this very easily with curved scissor blades. Another method that I just recently heard about that Scott Stisser uses is he simply lays the tinsel down on a surface that slightly gives, possibly a couple of 3x5 cards or something like that, and takes a single-edged razor blade, presses down on this edge rather firmly, and then quickly snaps the tinsel away, and it leaves this little residual cut behind and gives you a nice clean edge. Might be a whole lot faster to try that than play around with scissors and nick and nick and nick and make 3 or 4 mistakes and whack it off and try again, which a lot of the rest of us attempt to do. Now what I've done on this particular tinsel is somewhat like you saw in the third drawing that I showed to the far right. And I've got that little notch, and I'm going to catch that little notch with my thread underneath with a wrap of thread. Come forward with 2 or 3 wraps of thread just to get them out of the way. And now my tinsel is laid exactly in the right position to begin my initial wrap forward. Now I'm already past the point of my taper, and each wrap that I make is going to be exactly adjacent to, but not overlapping, the prior wrap. Now, if you see that they become slightly separated, you'll see a bit of a line. Come in with your fingernail and thumbnail and simply slide them back together to make them nice and even, and work up and down and make sure that that is the case. I'd like to comment now, you notice I'm using very narrow tinsel, and I mentioned that casually before. I feel I get a little bit smoother wrap with a narrow tinsel. It takes a lot longer, but I like the end result a bit better. And this is a metal tinsel. I like the way that metal tinsel lays rather than a mylar tinsel. It doesn't have that stretch to it. Now I'm right at the turnaround. This is kind of a critical point, and this is one of the real advantages to narrow tinsel. With a wide tinsel, you better plan it so that you're exactly right at the turnaround. Otherwise, you start smashing the butt down. The narrower the tinsel, the more mistakes you can make in getting it just exactly to that point, coming back around, and now beginning your wrap smoothly forward. Now I'm within 1 wrap of finishing these off. I'm going to remove all the wraps of thread that I put the tinsel on in the first place, and you see possibly that little tip end just begin to stick up. You're going to catch that little tip end now. Come around. Now this is kind of tricky with flat metal thread. You want to be careful how you handle your thread, because you can very easily cut the thread on metal tinsel. I'm going to come up and catch both that little tip end and the tinsel itself, and I try and tie it off somewhat onto the side. Again, I don't want any excess lumps and bumps on the top. It looks like it's going off on the top, but it's actually not. It's going off just on the high side of the near side toward me. Now I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping the rib. And at this point I want to mention that where I begin my rib is not exactly dead center underneath the hook. It's very slightly secured on the back side of the bottom. So that when I put pressure and begin that wrap, what you would see if you look underneath the fly is the tinsel will appear as if it's beginning precisely dead center underneath the hook, when in fact it actually was not. You'll find that it will look that way if you tie it in very slightly back toward the left-hand side of the fly. And if I haven't already mentioned, let me say now, this is the right-hand side, this is the left-hand side. This is the head of the fly. This is the left, this is the right. Now I'm going to begin my wrap and try and make, in this particular case, I've chosen to make 5 wraps of tinsel. I'm going to try and make my wraps with my hackle pliers because I seem, again, to have a little bit more control over the placement that way. 5 wraps of tinsel on this one section. Now, the way I'm going right now, it's probably going to end up pretty close. It may look like I'm going to end up a little bit too far forward, but I'm planning it that way. And I'll show you in a picture here why in just a moment. Now I'm going to stop it so that the tinsel is going to be secured slightly onto the edge near me. Now what I'm attempting to show by this card is the tinsel, where that I've finished it off. I've tried not to tie it off right here. I've tried to tie it off a little bit more onto the side. This is the right side of the fly, this is the left side of the fly, being a bottom view, head and bend, of course. And by tying it off on the side, I will not have a bump or a lump right in the middle that's going to allow my body veiling that's going to be underneath the fly to rotate or twist up onto its edge. So I'm very careful to tie it off slightly up on the side. Now, if there was no body veiling, I would go ahead and tie it off absolutely dead center or just a hair right of dead center, just like we started very slightly left of dead center at the back of the fly. But this one's quite a bit more round than that because of the veiling problem, and also the fact that the veiling is going to hide this tinsel anyway, so that you can't see precisely where it is tied off. So that'll save you a lot of tears, sweat, and blood for later. Now, in preparation for the body veilings that will be coming here shortly, we want to go ahead and shape those. So I've wetted them with a little saliva. It seems to hold them better than just water. Of course, these feathers have been thoroughly washed beforehand. I simply stack one on top of the other if I'm going to be doing more than one. Make sure they're nice and straight. And then put them in so that I get the correct curve and let them stamp down just like this. And then when they're dry, I'll go ahead and take them out, and as I discussed earlier, flick them out and shape them and so forth. At this point, we may have a little problem in that by trimming off this tinsel, you may be left with a bit of a bump right along this edge. In order to cover that so that you don't have an area that your hurl may actually slip and slide on, you're going to make sure and cover it with fanned wraps of thread and progress forward an equal distance as opposed to how we had done this particular butt. And in fanning the thread, we're going to stack thread and terrace it in such a fashion that this little bump that exists here is going to be covered smoothly. If we went with thread wraps that were adjacent to one another, we wouldn't accomplish any purpose. We're going to have to slightly overlap them so that we cover this and get a nice smooth foundation and tie it off about right in this area right here. And this will be where the butt goes, and this is also going to be where our tail veilings go. Now, in tying in the veilings, what I'm going to do is secure the top veiling in first, and I'm going to tie it from the front toward the back in smooth wrap. I'm going to very slightly overlap the butt so it somewhat cups into the butt. Also, I'm securing some of the barbs down in place too with these wraps. And then I'm going to very, very slightly pull the feather with the quill forward to pull some of the barbs that may be sticking out to the side a little bit very slightly into place, just like that. Now we're going to very simply turn the hook over in the vise, rotate the vise over, and tie the other side in the same manner, going back toward the front with our thread wraps. What I've done is go ahead and finish the bottom veiling, slide that, and now I've gone ahead and secured the ostrich hurl in the same fashion and cut off the butts of the veilings in the same fashion also as I did the tail veilings and tail. Now I'm going to simply wrap this herl in the same fashion that I did the back herl and hope that we don't break the tip. And we'll see what the end result looks like in a few seconds. Now I got lucky and it didn't break, and I went ahead and finished this off, and now the next project will be to apply the front rib in exactly the same fashion as what we did on the back rib. And you can either leave this on at this point or take it off, because floss can hide a lot more, and steel, particularly if you have steel in this section, can hide a lot more than tinsel can. So you could leave this little stub on and it would be hidden pretty easily. I'm going to put the tinsel on, a little wider tinsel in this front section. I'm going to put the tinsel on in exactly the same fashion, the same location. That's what I did on the back section. And spin my thread, make sure it's nice and smooth and wrapped. Now I'm going to simply progress forward to about this point and stop wrapping my thread. Then I'm going to be folding the hackle and preparing my silk floss next. Next process will be folding the hackle, and there are a lot of different ways to approach that. This is the approach that I use. I've prepared this, and this happens to be a saddle feather, but it's a saddle feather that tends to taper pretty dramatically. And for this particular fly, I like that kind of a taper. In fact, for most flies, for the body hackle, I like a fairly dramatic taper. For the throat, I prefer as little taper as possible. But in this situation, I want a pretty dramatic taper. And I'm going to take the feather with hackle pliers and grab onto the rake as a quill about in this area, hold it securely with my hackle pliers like this. I'm going to very simply fold this portion down and back. Now that looks pretty simple and it went down nicely, but as you get further out into here, it'll rotate. So what you need to do, once you fold this portion down and back, you need to grab it with your thumb and then take the tip and run that tip up against the edge of your index finger so that it folds those barbs down and back. Grab the next section and just repeat the process. Down and back. And as you do that, you will notice that there's a little rough edge on this back edge. You can take your index finger and just run it along there and feel that rough edge on the back side. If you're not feeling that, it's simply not folding. You can even fold marabou using this technique, or soft hackles, which makes a very nice flies. So we'll just continue that process quite a ways on down the feather. Down, holding things and rotating with your thumb, and then just simply allow it to slide through your fingertips, the barbs to slide through your fingertips as it creases the edge of the back barbs against your index finger. Down and back. Now, once the hackle is essentially folded, next step will be to prepare the tip. And what I'm going to do here is grab the tip and scissor out just a portion on either side, clipping the barbs out of the way. And then when I actually tie this feather in, it will be tied in by the tip in this section right here. Now we'll add the floss in the same manner that we did on the tag of the fly earlier, except this time the floss is going to be 2 strands instead of 1 strand. Pull it up, secure it in place with 2 or 3 wraps of thread to get it out of the way. Go ahead and pull it down and try and keep the 2 strands slightly separated so that you can put them adjacent to one another. You don't want them overlapping one another, you want them alongside of each other. So try and keep them just as parallel as you possibly can. In fact, you may find it beneficial to literally separate them this point, lay them side by side, and then periodically separate them again and again until you're happy that they are laying where you want them to be. Then we'll just continue to wrap back toward the back, nice, smooth, even wraps. Like this. So we still have our strands separate and parallel to one another, just laying adjacent to one another. And we're going to come around at the turnaround with nice, smooth, firm wraps, and then just begin to move back forward again. Now we're not going to go all the way back to the front because we're going to use the floss itself to secure the hackle in place. And so we're going to stop temporarily about right here. And the next step, and the way we stop, is just simply take our hackle pliers to secure the floss in place. We're going to stop and take the tinsel and wind the tinsel progressively forward in nice, smooth, even wraps. Now, in this fly, I've chosen, again, 5 wraps of tinsel. So let's see where the wraps go and find out where we need to put our hackle in place. It looks to me like I'm probably going to be a little too far forward with my floss, possibly. We'll see. This is just kind of a test drive to see where that tinsel needs to go to get nice, 5 nice even wraps of tinsel. So you can see I have it a little too separate and I'm ending in a little bit the wrong spot. So what I'm going to do is just simply back off on the tinsel. I'm also going to back off on 1 wrap of floss, and we'll try the step again. We'll keep trying that until we get it exactly where we want it to be before we tie in the hackle. What I'm going to do is, now that I've decided where I want the tinsel ribs to be and where I want this hackle to be, I'm going to take the tip of the hackle, slide it in tight into the notch of the floss, and catch it a little bit on the back side because the floss is going to pull it a little bit forward to me. And then slide it into position. And then just simply continue my floss wraps until I get up to the front of the fly. And secure the hackle in using this technique. Now, I'm going to begin to wrap the tinsel forward, and I want the bottom of the beginning of the second wrap of tinsel to be right at this point where the hackle is tied in. And that's where that hackle is going to begin, at that base of that second wrap. I prefer doing that rather than putting it back at the butt. There are a few exceptions to that, flies like possibly leaves blue and gray or some others. But basically that's where I want the hackle to begin, right at the base of that. So I'm going to make sure I'm not catching any material on the hackle. Come up and around with my hackle pliers again so I have some control. Carefully pull the hackle up and out of the way, get all the stray barbs out of the way so nothing is caught. And I should be, if I plan things correctly, beginning my second wrap right at the spot that the hackle is at. And we'll continue forward. And theoretically, if everything is done correctly, I should be able to end my 5th wrap just very slightly near me, just like we did on the tinsel rib in the back. And the reason I like to end it near me, and maybe even dramatically so, is so that when the throat is put onto the fly, you will see 5 wraps of tinsel from any and all directions. If you end it right square underneath in the bottom, you generally miss that, and you won't see that 5th wrap. So I'll bring it up and around and tie it off onto the side of the fly. Right like that. Now, in securing the tinsel off, I'm going to put 3 wraps of thread down to secure it in this place. Then what I'm going to do is bring the hackle forward. I'm going to take off 2 wraps of thread and then put on 3 more. So 4 wraps of thread hold those 2 materials in place. As I wrap the hackle forward, I'm going to let it take somewhat of a natural set immediately behind each rib. I'm going to let it go every half turn so that it will swing back to the back. So every time it comes around, I'll just let it take a natural set. And you can see what that's doing to the hackle. Now I've made 4 wraps of hackle, and at this point I'm going to make 1 additional wrap of hackle, again letting it seat naturally, coming around, coming back up. And you can begin to see the taper that I've formed coming back up with a short hackle back in this area. What I'm going to do is see where the thread is going to be tied off, and you can come up with your thread and work it up and through using that fashion to secure it. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, afraid that you're possibly going to catch some barbs, another approach that you might possibly use is see where it's going to be tied off. Simply come in, take your index finger and thumbnail, strip off those barbs so that you have now a clear piece of quill. The tricky part is you don't want to break the quill, because then you tend to get very upset and say things you might be real sorry for. So make sure and be clean and careful at this point. Fairly durable, actually. You can get a little vicious with it to a degree. Then go ahead and tie it off. Oh, I beg your pardon, we forgot a step here. Let me back up. Remember, we put on 3 wraps of thread. We're going to take off 2, come back up, and secure this in place with 3 wraps of thread. Each wrap slightly in front of the other with flat, smooth wraps of thread. What I'm going to do is fold the hackle on the top down and along the sides to get it down and out of the way of the wing. I'm going to simply come through with my scissor point. Once I get it separate with a scissor blade, I'm going to push down. Simply take my fingers, come down on top, and hold them down in place underneath, and pinch firmly, very, very firmly. And then gradually work my way back using the same technique, making sure the barbs that need to be on the right go on the right, barbs that need to go on the left go to the left. Hold them firmly in place, down and back, pulling with this hand, pushing and squeezing with this hand, working your way back to the butt. Sometimes there will be a few stray barbs that are just obstreperous, and I love that word, and they tend to go their own wonderful direction. So what I like to do is come in and very carefully peel those little guys out of my way so that they're no longer a problem. Just 1 or 2 at a time. If you try and do more than that, you may possibly break the stem of the hackle. Now, what I'm going to use for the throat of this fly, instead of using J, our dyed blue guinea fowl is a Kenya crested guinea fowl. It's quite a lovely feather and has a little bit of a blue ring and a very slight pale blue dot and a black feather. The problem is when you get into this kind of a feather is that it tends to have a reverse curve on this side, and therefore you end up with a throat that's intermixed like this instead of a nice sweeping throat to the back. So what I'm going to do is actually strip one side off. I'm going to strip the top side as the feather faces you off, and we're going to tie it in by the tip and wind it forward. The reason I'm not using natural J on this particular fly is the fact that natural J tends to be very, very limited in size, and getting natural European J in a size much larger than 2/0 is extremely difficult. So we're going to go ahead and strip this one side off and use this feather. I'm going to remove 2 wraps of thread that we use to secure the body hackle in place, cut out the tip of the throat hackle and make a little bit of a very small little tab to tie in with. Pull back and slide it in up and underneath. Secure it in place with about 3 wraps of thread. And wind in the same fashion as we did with the hackle. Try and keep the barbs as perpendicular from the stem as possible. Pull them out so they lay in nice and clean. Try and make it take a fairly natural set as it comes up and around the hook. Be careful not to crowd the eye area. Pull it up perpendicular. The problem is if you don't pull it up and perpendicular, what will happen is some of the barbs will get trapped, caught up and underneath, and then you'll have to unwrap it to untrap them. To wrap the hackle, I'm going to begin to fold and fold down the barbs onto either side, and pull them down somewhat straight down. Come up with a fairly soft thread wrap up and over and back down on the other side. Try and force the material to stay down. I'm going to take a little brush. This happens to be off an electric razor. And simply brush it out, have it flare out. and see if we've got it placed now where we want it. And if a couple of stray barbs come up, again, we can very carefully peel those off. And once we're satisfied that everything is good and secure, what we're going to do is go ahead and cut off the quill, hopefully not cut off our thread. And at this point, we'll go ahead and whip finish the primrose thread and get rid of it. And then we'll take a real close look and see what we've done thus far before we get into the wing. Very smooth wraps, tying forward to finish off your whip finish. Slide it in, pull it up tight, and even though this is not going to show, it's going to be covered, slice it off. Now, I've gone ahead and completed the wing, and I've mixed it in this particular fashion. This is not necessarily the order that Price Tannic calls for, but I've taken liberty, and in this case taken florican, then yellow, red, yellow, and red. And take that back. It's a red, yellow, red, and then 2 strips of speckled bustard, then red, blue, so on and so forth, up until I get 2 more strips of bustard, and then the repeat of the red and the yellow, then gray turkey, and then 2 strands of golden pheasant on top of that. What we're going to talk about right now is basically how to marry these barbs together so that we end up with something that looks like this. We won't necessarily do this particular wing, but I want you to see how we approach that. Now, in this particular instance, I pulled out for you a dyed red turkey tail, and this being the front side of the feather with a curving slightly going toward the back edge. This is the back side of the feather. This is the bird's right side. This is the bird's left side. This strip is going to be used on the fly's right side, and thus this strip on the left side. You must remember that when you cut your strips off, lay these strips on one side and lay these strips on the other. My personal preference is anything coming off of this side goes over to this side of me. This side goes over to this side of me. It doesn't really matter how you decide to do it. Maybe you'll want the right wing slip to go on your right side and the left wing slip to go on your left side. The problem you're going to run into, though, if you don't select an order and stand by it from here on out, is that you're going to get a few of these strips of one feather intermingled with a few strips from this feather, and they are simply not going to marry. Also, you want to put the strips on with a natural tip curving in this fashion so that it goes on to the fly with a tip curving upward. Oftentimes I've seen salmon flies tied on with this strip going like this. And you get a wonderful seesaw, jigsaw pattern to the tip of the wing by doing that. This is the right wing, and it's the bird's right side. This is the left wing, and it's the bird's left side. When marrying strips together, it's a very simple process of taking one strip and matching it to another strip from the same side of the bird, same side of the feather. Simply laying them alongside of one another, overlapping the edges very slightly, and pulling them together, and they're now married. But if you want to get a little more adventuresome and you want to possibly do single barb to single barb, a fun way to do it, I think at least, is to have one strip that acts somewhat as a handle, marry on the next color that's going to be adjacent to this one, take a bodkin, come in and strip out all but 1 barb or 2 barbs or 3 barbs or whatever you choose to remove by simply going like this. Remove that, lay that aside, select your next color. In this case, I have a strip of yellow. We'll match that strip up, lay it alongside, marry it in. Also, the feather, by the way, doesn't tend to marry very easily. Sometimes what you can do is hump the feather and roll it like this, and it tends to interlock the barbules and the hooklets, as they're referred, to connect and hold the barbs firmly in place. Come back, strip out all but one barb or two barbs or three barbs or whatever you choose. Possibly select another feather to go adjacent to that. Line it up. Put it in place. Marry it alongside. Once you're sure it's securely married in, come back. Separate all but one barb, two barbs, however many you choose. Now, once you've done a staircase of colors and so forth, maybe you want this blue to go on top of this. So simply come down, strip out all but maybe the first barb or the second barb or the third barb, whatever you choose to remove. Simply take that and lay that on top of this strip. It's a very simple matter of laying them alongside of one another and pulling them together. Now, I've overlapped here. A quick way to resolve that problem, come in and just very carefully separate it out and then remarry that tip until it goes into place that you're satisfied. All the while you're trying to build a gradual taper coming up. And you see there's well, you may not see, but there's a fairly abrupt taper. It comes up fairly square and then drops up high here. If you're only going to be using one barb, simple solution there is you don't worry about it. You line up that one barb and you go to the next. But if you wanted to have 3 or 4 barbs, you'd have a fairly straight edge and a sudden knife edge coming up at a wrong angle. If you see that that's going to take place, take this strip off and realign this tip so it's not quite so sharp by simply turning the feather down and remarry it. And work it down, work it down, work it down until you get that edge so that it's a little bit straighter, similar to what you're trying to marry into. Just keep working it down. Now, it's more difficult to straighten that edge than it is to foreshorten it. To foreshorten it, to make it a sharper edge, it's very simple. You simply push up, and it loves to go that direction. Now you have a very steep edge, and it will go that direction to a grand extreme that you have almost individual barbs sticking straight out. Just keep working it until you get a much, much sharper edge. But that's basically the simple process that I've gone through in making the wing that we're going to use on this fly. Simply taking strips and marrying them to strips, planning them out in advance, possibly sketching them out in colored pencil if you wish, or you may simply write, as I normally do, letters. R for red or scarlet, and Y for yellow, and B for blue, and B with a line under it for bustard, and so forth, until I get a combination that I think is going to be pleasing to me, and then I simply marry it together. Try different combinations. Don't necessarily stick with a set pattern. Don't necessarily stick with 5 barbs of this color, 5 barbs of that color, 5 barbs. Be inconsistent. Vary it. Try different techniques and approaches to it. See what kind of end product you can come up with. Now, I've gone ahead and attached the black thread, and so we're ready to go ahead and mount the wing. The particular fly, the Baron, calls for a tippet in strands for the underwing. And oftentimes, what takes place is you simply strip off of a tippet feather and roll it, or fold it, so that you get the bright gold color all the way around the strip. You need to lay it in essentially in this fashion, or sometimes take another set of a strip and lay it over the top and vary it. Sometimes what will happen is you'll twist it in your fingers and maybe even uneven it very slightly, make it just a little bit more ragged and a little more scraggly looking. A lot of different approaches that you can take to this particular step. What I want to do is show you a little different approach that I've been playing with lately that solves some problems for me. One of the problems that I've found is that if you're tying on a fairly large hook and the tippets are not quite long enough to accomplish the length of the fly, or possibly you can just barely make it and you don't have any butts extending on out. And the reason I want butts extending on out is because they act as somewhat of a stabilizer for the wing when I mount the main wing in and of itself. What I've been doing lately to resolve those problems is to use a whole feather, trim out of that feather a section like this. I trim out the tip, I remove all the barbs below, on the opposite side, remove these barbs out, and remove the tip section, as I say, out. And get a shape similar to this. And then I take a feather matching the opposing side, lay those strips together, and come up with an underwing shape like this. And then I'm going to mount that underwing on our fly right here. Now the tips of the quill, or the butts of the quill, are going to extend out beyond the eye and act as, again, that stabilizer. Also, these quills right here are much smaller in diameter than if I put in a rolled batch of strands. Therefore, the bulk is much reduced. And you can lay this wherever you want to. You can lay it way back in here. You can lay it way up in here. You choose where you want it. In this particular case, I think I'm going to split this back butt with these two bars and lay it in just about like that. Now, simply wrap the quill stems in, and then check and make sure it's where you want it to be. And this is basically what I want the underwing to be in this fly. I'm going to separate the butt with these two bars pretty much equidistant. We're going to leave these butts on. I think I'll foreshorten them some, just so I don't bump into them. I'm less likely to bump into them and cause myself trouble. But I want those stems to help to seat that wing. Now, quickly and carefully, I'm going to bring my thread, and notice where I've come down here, by the way. I'm just a little bit shy of that point of the end of the hook by about a 32nd of an inch. I'm going to hold these underwings firmly, come back with a single wrap of thread to drop in here. Okay? Just fan it once so that you can drop in right at the base of the throat with your thread wraps. Make sure everything stays nicely in place. And the next step, we're ready to put on the main wing. What I'd like to do now is show you a nervous fly tire. You will notice the gnawed thumbnail and so forth. What we've got here basically is the shank of the hook and the eye of the hook, the wing represented by this dotted line and so forth, and the solid line up above. Basically where your thumb and index finger on the opposing side, or middle finger if you choose, are going to be supporting and holding the wing. Not up at an angle like this. You support the wing to mount it at an angle like this, the wing will tend to go up in that fashion. If you hold the wing more parallel with the shank of the hook, then it tends to lay more parallel with the shank of the hook. So depending on the end result, I prefer the wing to lay more down along the shank of the hook, and that may be part of the reason why I tend to like longer hooks, because I like that longer, sleeker look. This is basically the way that it should look after it is collapsed. The wing butts are pulled down, the thread wrap is secured here. I'm going to take 3 thread wraps here. Before I let anything go, I'm going to take 2 thread wraps about here. Then I'll let it go and take a look at it. Then what we're going to be doing is firming up these butts and straightening them up and so forth, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. But before we get into that, let me back up a little bit and show you what it looks like with the wing before it is collapsed. Now you notice on this sketch that we have essentially the same situation, except now the wing butts are not collapsed. So this is the situation we're in as we're getting ready to mount the wing. Also, the wing has very slightly come down around the shank of the hook. Here's the end of the shank of the hook. It's just very slightly down. The thread's going to pull it back up so it seats up on this upper edge, slightly near you on the near wing, slightly away from you on the left wing. It's going to be pretty much on this top edge, even though when you first bring it in place, it's going to slide down, just down like this, very, very slightly. Now, the way that the thread wraps will go 3 times in a row is you're going to come around the shank of the hook toward you, near the right wing, up and over the top loosely at an angle, aiming back toward the tail of the hook, at about this angle, 20 or 25 degree angle, something like that. Come back down softly, soft loop, come around the shank of the hook at essentially the same point you began. not behind it, that's for certain, and if at all in front, very, very slightly, preferably right essentially over that wrap that you came up and around with. Come up with your thread straight up and begin to pull firmly up. Now, what will happen is you will feel this wing to begin to collapse. You'll also feel underneath your fingers this thread right here sliding and coming down. As you feel it begin to slide, what you want to do is roll your index finger or your middle finger, whichever you choose to use, and thumb very slightly apart like this, so the thread has a chance to slide down and through. The amount of pressure is very, very firm, surprisingly firm, and a lot of people are surprised how firm you have to hold it. If you hold it too loosely, the whole thing will buckle and collapse. So hold it firmly. Never release the quantity of pressure, just where you hold the pressure by rolling your fingers slightly back as this begins to slide forward, allowing, in other words, this thread to slide out of your hand and compressing this wing. Make sure your thread is pulling vertically if you use this approach to mounting the wing. Now we're going to go back to the other drawing and show you the end result again. Now again, you will notice that the wing has collapsed, but notice the thumb, the well-gnawed thumbnail, have not moved. Everything is stationary, but you'll notice also the wing is pulled up a little bit on top of this edge of the shank of the hook. So please note basically the position of the hand, that it has not changed except this rolling approach that I mentioned before, simply rolling the fingers back out. Okay, let's go ahead now and mount the wing. One more thing before we get to the wing. That's these guys here. What's going to happen is that after you put your initial 3 wraps here, and then bring your thread very slightly forward with 2 more wraps here, just securing things in place, you'll find that these wing butts will tend to rotate and twist toward the left and away from you. Before you let anything go and look at this wing, grab in your right hand, if you're right hand tire, these wing butts with your thumb and index finger and very firmly pull them back and up and work them and seat them and work them and get kind of vicious with them, quite frankly. Make sure that they come right back up on the top. That's part of the reason why we're tying this fly with those quills underneath extending on out, to help support this and keep it from twisting over quite that far. So get a little nasty with them and pull them back up. Make sure they're well seated directly on top. If they roll away, they will allow the far wing to be buckled. Preparing these wings, what I've done is I've matched sides up so they're nice and even. A little cupping underneath. That little cupping is going to be going right into this underwing, so it lays in just like this. I'm going to match it up to the length that I want. Position everything nice and clean and cover it with my thumb and index finger. Try and separate it right in here so that we go on either side of those underwings. That's not feeling like it's going, so I'm going to reach up and go in like this again. Pinch it firmly there and get in position that you want to be. Make sure your thread is counterspun and smooth so that it slides on that top of the wing a little bit better. Come back up, reach up, pinch it lightly, allow it to slide back down the other side a little bit, and you can feel it in there with your fingers. Come up right at the base of the throat and simply start to pull up. As you're pulling up, you'll feel the thread begin to slide. Slip. Okay, now I'm going to come off of that. We're going to come up into it again. And we're going to come into it again. And we're going to come into it again. Now I'm going to begin to seat those wing butts up, around, come forward a couple of wraps, seat them again, come back and look at my wing to see if it's laying where I want it to lay. And if I'm satisfied with that, I'll leave it. If I'm not, I'll take it off and remount it. The main thing is you don't want to allow this to buckle if you can avoid it. And by simply keeping firm pressure, you can avoid that from happening. Now you can see your wing, underwing is seated where you want it to. Nothing shows unnecessarily underneath where it doesn't need to. And your wing is laying nice and straight with the body. Now I want to give you an idea of what the wing looks like after we've mounted it. Notice where the thread is hanging right now. We've got 3 wraps at the base of the wing, slight separation, 2 wraps toward the front. The reason for that separation is separated thread wraps are not going to allow the wing to hinge and move. Wraps over top of one another will allow the wing to move if it's slightly bumped or tapped. Now, I'm going to hold the wing firmly and remove those 2 front thread wraps. Actually, there's 3 as it turns out. Sorry about that. Can't count my old age. I come in with the scissors and remove those wing butts right now. Get them out of the way. Hold everything very firmly. Once we have those snipped off, then we're going to go ahead and begin to somewhat shape the head, but with as few wraps of thread as possible. Now the next step will be to put on the shoulders of the fly, the strips of wood duck and teal. In this case I'm using wood duck and pintail, because pintail tends to marry much nicer and still has the look of the teal. What we're going to do is leave the quill onto that strip. I'm going to put a little bit of a hump in the feather like this. Take the pintail or teal substitute, essentially the same shape. You notice this is a very square edge. This happens to be somewhat of a curved edge. We'll lay this curve so that it just follows the line and comes right up to this tip. Marry them simply the same manner that you do for the rest of the wing. Lay them alongside of one another and marry them in together. Now, in the process of mounting this onto the side of the hook, I'm going to put a little hump in it, like this, and I call it throwing the feather into the side of the fly. I'm going to roll it in like this so it's somewhat buckled. Catch it and pinch it right here. Push these tips down. Make sure my thread is nice and flat and position it where I want it to be. Come up with a soft loop of thread. Come over and slide the thread down and allow it to fall right into position. Come up with the thread pressure. I'll take one more wrap of thread and we'll take a look and see if it's positioned where we want it to be. And I've gotten the other side in the same sort of approach, and I like to have them laid somewhat of a little bit of an angle to give more dimension to the fly. Some tyers like a very two-dimensional fly. I like a fly that has very much three-dimension, of full throat and full Indian crow, a full wing that tapers out here and comes together flat back here. And I like the shoulders to be flush and then to roll out. The other side has done essentially the same thing. I don't know if you can really see that on your television or not, but it buckles out just a little bit away from the wing. So to get some sort of a hinting effect to those 2 strips of feather. Now I'm going to come in with my scissors and very carefully trim these out. The next step will be to put on the side and the cheeks, and then we're going to be putting on the roof right after that. I'd like you to notice where this shoulder is laying in, with the amount of thread wraps we have here, the beginning of the shape of the head right here. Termination of the wire right like that, so that everything is well planned where we're going to be. The head's going to end actually about right here, just shy of the wire. So kind of get a feeling for where the shoulder is laying, what position it lays with the wing and so forth, and how we've trimmed everything off nice and clean. The next step will be simply tying in the sides, and the sides are going to be the jungle cock. Jungle cock I like to lay in fairly long. I don't like to lay it in real short and vertical. My preference is to lay it somewhat low and down so that we get a little bit of a veiling of the body by these barbs right up in here. I like them fairly small and fairly long. Once I get it essentially measured to where I want it to be, I'll simply flare out some of the barbs, lay it back in and see if that's a satisfactory length for what I'm after. I think I'll shorten that just a little bit. And see, I'm pressing it in just in this little flat spot here and slightly along this edge that's beginning to roll out to me. So I get basically that kind of a look. Now, I'm going to take my flat nose pliers, leave the barbs on since the quill tends to not rotate, and simply smash it flat. And that will allow it to stay nice and flat right up at this tie-in spot right here. Once I get it flattened out satisfactorily, then I'll go ahead and strip off or trim off these barbs. Now, with the flat thread, I'll come up and secure the jungle cock here and here. I'll come back and look at it, see if it's laying where I'm satisfied. Not exactly where I want it. I'll see if I can kick it to a little different position. And again, it's laying out a little bit of an angle so that it's somewhat three-dimensional. And the way I got it to lay it a little bit of an angle so it's not exactly parallel with the wing is by tying it just a little bit high on the shoulder of the head rather than lower on the flat portion of the head, or more on the side, if that makes more sense. I'm up a little higher on this shoulder rather than down in this area, if you can envision this kind of effect here. For the left jungle cock cheek, I've chosen a feather you can see curves slightly in this projection up. There's a curve going up. And it's going to be the opposing side to lay in the same fashion as this, near right side. And I've measured it to this side so that they're exactly the same length. Strip the barbs and smash the quill accordingly, and now I'll apply it on the other side in the same fashion that I did this with 2 wraps of thread. Now, the cheeks will be laid over the side in exactly the same fashion as the jungle cock were prepared. I'm going to very simply measure them, strip them. Before I strip them though, since this is a very fragile quill, I will take my flat nose pliers and smash the quill, then either strip or actually scissor these ends off. So I'll be going like this, measure it to the length that I'm satisfied with, smash it down flat, come back with my scissors, snip these barbs out, so I get an equal number of barbs off either side removed. Stroke the feather together, lay it in place and secure it in the same fashion that I did the jungle cock, but probably with a single turn initially until I apply the second side, then come over both with one final turn, and that saves me 1 wrap of thread and 1 excessive amount of bulk. Also, I might mention that when I applied the other jungle cock on the other side, I removed a half a wrap of thread, came up, put the jungle cock in place, and then came on around, so that actually the second wrap of thread really was applied to both jungle cock. Then there was a third wrap that secured them in place. So actually 3 wraps were involved in tying both jungle cock in place, and essentially that's the same thing that I'm going to do here. Now, simply come up with your thread, secure it in place, drop the thread over the other side, and make sure this feather is laying where you want it to lay. Now I'll simply come in with my scissors, very carefully cut off stems. Be careful at this point so that nothing twists. That's the most important part. Be very careful that nothing twists. Now the way that you can avoid something twisting is by making sure that you have wraps of thread both here and here. Not one wrap of thread continually over the same spot. Separate your wraps of thread to avoid a hinging position so that when you come in and snip them, they don't rotate or slip or twist. The brown mallard roof, what I like to do is take a single strip from a side that has a nice curve that matches pretty much the shape of my wing. What I like to do is select a section that is about the right width for what I'm after, come in and scissor it out, pull it out, work it out until I completely reshape that strip. And instead of using 2 strips for the roof, my own personal preference is I like to use 1. Pinch it together and try and remarry it as much as possible into a completely different configuration. from what it was initially. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to very simply strip this off, leaving some of the quill stem attached. Get rid of the majority of that. All the extraneous materials that don't have to be there. And then what I'm going to do is take this and fold it right in the middle. And that's going to act as my roof on either side. And what I'm going to do is form a little bit of a shoulder right for this area right in here because it's not quite steep enough. I'm going to do something I saw Bill Hunter do a long time ago. Pull a material down and pinch it like this. In fact, I must say at this point that Bill Hunter deserves a lot of the credit for a lot of the techniques that I use in my salmon flies. For instance, mounting the wing is his and several other techniques. There's so many people that help so many of us when we're tying flies in general, salmon flies or anything else. And I don't think hardly any of us, I can't say none, but hardly any of us can claim sole credit for everything that we do. So often we see other people doing things and we learn different techniques. We may modify those techniques, but we oftentimes steal them from others. And I certainly am known for stealing techniques and ideas from other people. And I like to share a lot of those stolen techniques and ideas with other people, and obviously that's why you're seeing this tape right now, because you like to share in those ideas. But I hope you certainly give credit to those people when it's due. Now, after I pinch this for a period of time, pretty well it's taken on the shape of the shoulder of the fly. We're going to lay that into the wing in this configuration. Then we're going to tie this down. In the process of tying this down, we're going to try and catch it with soft loops of thread and try and come up on it with our pressure. If we pull toward us or away from us, it will tend to roll or twist the roof quite a little bit. So this is kind of a tedious step, and frankly, I think I'm going to stop the tape again so that I can do it without having to talk to you. Sorry about that. And when I'm tying this particular step in, sometimes materials may not lay exactly where I want them to lay. And I've found that by simply using a paintbrush and saliva, not water, but saliva, I can paint particular materials into place if I do it very judiciously. For instance, this particular shoulder was setting up far enough up underneath the roof that I really couldn't see it. And if this fly, say, for instance, was to be framed, in jarring and jostling over the years, this would possibly slip up a little bit up underneath the roof. By pulling it down and very carefully painting up underneath that edge, I can secure that into place, and it will stay there, and it won't go anywhere unless someone goes in and physically moves that feather. It's almost like a glue to secure it in place. You'll also notice that I now have the roof in place, and it somewhat tints over the top of the fly. And now the next step will be to put on our toppings, and finally the horn and the head. Now, I've prepared a topping by simply stripping off the residual fluff and foofarraw down here and shaped the feather pretty much to my needs, or at least actually I've chosen one in advance that was shaped pretty much the way I wanted it by nicking it into position as we did with the tail, and also tying in, as we will do, just like we did in the tail, in this pithy portion of the feather. We'll end up with a wing crest arrangement, something like this when we're all said and done. And now what we have to do is simply shape this and tweak this into position so that it will be exactly the right length, so we get the tail and the tip, in my preference, almost exactly together. That doesn't mean that's the way it has to be done. That's the way I've chosen to do on this particular fly. I want it to come together just like it is right now, just exactly together. What I've done now is trimmed and shaped this tip so it's going to essentially fit with the shape of the top of the head. And something I didn't show you is soft looping the brown mallard into place, coming up with the thread, bringing very gently over and back up and pulling it in with a soft loop. is a very, very soft piece of thread. If the thread is twisted, it will twist as it goes over in that soft fashion. If the thread is untwisted, you'll be able to place the thread very softly, like I'm doing right there, very softly, exactly where you want it to be. Now I'm going to do essentially the same approach in applying the topping. Soft loop up and over and securing it in place, and then taking a look at it. And if we're off, we need to take it off and readjust it. If not, we secure it from there. Obviously I'm off. What we'll need to do is take this off and readjust it. Keep working at it until you get it in a position that you're satisfied with. Now we're coming closer, but we're not there. We've got a hole right up underneath here. I'm going to have to pull it down to cover that hole so it's seated more like that. Now I'll keep working on that until we get it exactly right. Just keep reseating and reseating until you can get it satisfactory. Once the wing is mounted so that the tail and the topping meet satisfactorily, or at least you think they are, and I've pretty well formed the shape of my head, at least to this point, with the stem curling down and forming the shape of that head, I'm going to come up underneath with my bodkin. I'm going to very carefully slip those barbs that belong on the near side out and toward me. With the veil, or as I often sometimes like to refer to it, starburst onto this side. And then I'm going to simply turn the fly over, reach up on the opposing side, up and underneath with my bodkin, and do precisely the same thing. Now I may do this 3 or 4 times till I get it to my satisfaction. Something like that. Now, we're going to select the horns out, and please bear in mind when you buy macaw, don't buy a quote-unquote center tail. There's 2 center tails, the right and the left. You notice the barb size over here is not the same as the barb size over here. A little bit longer barb here on this side than we do on this side. Now, you get the other side feather, and you can look at the bases and see the difference down there. You see that this is the different side from this side. Okay, you'll notice this is a dramatic difference on this feather. Look at the length on this side as opposed to the length on this side. That's more typical. You get a very dramatic difference. So if you try and tie with a feather like this on both sides, you may run short if you tie this side in first and suddenly realize, oops, I'm way too short. Also, the curvature on this side will be much more dramatic in its arc to the back. This side will tend to be flatter. The longer side tends to be a little flatter. So be careful in your selection of macaw. You want to make sure and get a right and a left, and preferably a pair if at all possible, so that your curve here is the same. Now, if you'd like to tie a very two-dimensional fly, you may prefer to go to side tails. The barbs tend to be longer on the first side tail adjacent to the centers, and they tend to be very, very straight in nature. And that way you can tie a very flat two-dimensional fly with that kind of a barb. Again, I like very three-dimensional flies, so therefore I always prefer going to the center tails to select a slightly more curved feather or barb so that it will lay out and arc back nice and clean for me. Now, when selecting the horns, again, it's the same approach as with any other feather. If you take the feather and you simply lay the face side of the feather facing the fly like this, the barbs on the near side will go on the near side, the barbs on the far side will go on the far side. Again, the bird's left side, the bird's right side, the fly's right side, the fly's left side, right, right, left, left. The same approach with a macaw. Select the feather that you want for the right side to go on the right side. Select the feather that you want to go on the left side. Take a barb from that side and place it on the opposing side. I like to use my flat-nosed pliers, pinch the barb that I've chosen and very carefully measure it and position it and so forth until I get it to a satisfactory position for me. Once I get it to a satisfactory position, in this case I like it to be just in this notch that's filling right back here, a little bit, maybe a little higher than the topping sometimes, never longer than the tail in itself, but always right up in this area. Once I get that particular spot, just so that I will remember it, I'll pinch the feather just slightly, just like that. So it leaves a slight little mark on the barb, just a little flat spot on the barb, so that I know where to catch it with my thread. Now, I'm going to take my thread again. This has constantly been flat thread. It goes without saying that it's constantly flat thread, so I'm constantly checking to make sure that it's exactly flat. I'm going to take off about a half a turn of thread and utilize a thread wrap that was used for another step. Come in and catch this material with a soft loop of thread up near the top edge of the shoulder of the head. See how it's placed. I'm not satisfied with that. Maybe it curves a little too much, and I'll find another placement for it until I'm satisfied. Keep trying to place it until you end up with a barb going exactly where you want it to go, not where it necessarily wants to go, but where you want that barb to lay. Now it's fallen in a position that's pretty much that I want it. I'm going to take a second loop just to catch the end so that I don't get a hinging effect by it. I'm going to take the second barb, and I'm going to show you the problem that you run into if you select feathers that don't match. If you select a feather that matches, when you lay these up alongside of one another, the tips of the barbs would be even. Now you may not be able to see that in your television set, but suffice it to say, this barb that I've just tied in is very straight. This barb that I'm laying alongside of it for measurement purposes has a little bit of a curve down in here. Sometimes you can do a little bit of cheating by simply taking this barb, coming in here with a fingernail on the back side, and just gently stroking it with the edge of your fingernail against the flat portion of your thumb. Now we'll flatten it out and straighten it out. Do the reverse of that to make it curve. Do it very, very gingerly until you get it to the shape that you're satisfied that you need. Come back in here and straighten up in here a little bit if you want to, and you can see it's slightly flattened now. Now let's lay it alongside the other barb and see if we have a comparable shape. If we do, we've accomplished our purpose. If not, we need to work a little bit more. In this case, I need to flatten it just a little bit more. Right at the tip. And once I get it satisfactory, then I'll simply move my flatten nose pliers up and down the stem until I get them positioned exactly the same length, precisely the same length as the other barb is. And we'll lay it in on the opposing side in the same fashion that we did here, with two wraps of thread slightly separated, trimming off the excess end down here. Now, I've got the horns in place so that they're secure. One is pretty much opposite the other one. They're not touching in the back, but they're nice and even. And all I'm simply going to do now is try and close up any thing that needs to be covered by my thread wrap and make a nice little half round or bullet head shaped head here to finish off the fly. And I'm going to go ahead and just very simply move in with firm, secure wraps, nothing vicious, but nice firm wraps to cover up those spots. And then once you have basically the shape of the head to your satisfaction, I like to whip finish back here in this area. Try not to whip finish near the eye of the hook. Try and whip finish up on top if possible. If you do try and whip finish near the eye of the hook, then what you end up with is extending your eye on out and making a little bit more of a sloppy, elongated head. If that's what you want, a more elongated head, that's fine. But in my particular situation, I want essentially a little half ball sort of a shape. Bullet head is oftentimes it's referred to. So I want to keep my whip finish up on top. Again, I've counterspun my thread to get all the twists out. I'm going to simply come up and hand whip finish right up on top. Very slightly wrapping my thread wraps forward. There's a very small hollow right up on the top of the head. And now I'm just simply filling that hollow. Come in with my bodkin or scissor tips Simply slide that tight, pull it in firmly, and again, under pressure, simply slice off the thread. Finally, the last step will be to paint the head. And the first thing that I'll do is put on a thin coat of Price's, or this is Angler's Corner, which is the same thing, head cement, a thin coat. And that drinks in pretty well and secures things in place. Then I'll paint with a paintbrush, literally paint 2 thin coats onto the head. Each time I paint a coat on, I'll set it fairly vertically and stick it in a cork or something to set it vertically to let the head cement drain back in and form somewhat of a ball head. Then I'll come back with a second coat and finally put on top of that. And generally 2 coats is most adequate of the thick head cement. So we'll simply begin to paint it on. Brace your hand against your vise. And you can simply leave it in the vise, essentially in that fashion, dry for the first coat if you wish. Well, there it is. Some things aren't exactly the way that we would like it to be. Jungle cock on this side is a little higher than I would like it to be, and it's kicked out just a little bit. In fact, to show you my mistake, I'll let you see how it kicks out. I'd like to see that a little cleaner and smoother. As with every fly I tie, we always learn a little bit. There's always some kind of a mistake or some little thing that we can do to make the fly a little bit better.